Oil never washes out completely. He knows that. 12 years as an engineer, 3 years as a mechanic, everything in between. The stains live in the knuckle lines now. Permanent is a signature. The kind of a mark a life leaves when it decides to test a man and he decides to keep showing up anyway. Portland, October. Rain like the city never learned another language. In a two-bay shop on a street that smells like diesel and yesterday's coffee, a man lies under a truck that isn't his. Hands working, mind somewhere else entirely. Then the phone rings, a woman's voice, cold, practiced. No greeting, no preamble, the voice of someone who has never once in her professional life waited for permission. 20 minutes, she says. He looks at his hands, looks at the calendar on the wall, looks at the name written there in red marker by someone who trusts him completely. And somewhere across this city, in a glass house above the clouds, a door is already opening. He just doesn't know yet what's behind it. The call came at 6:47 in the morning. James Smith was flat on his back under a 2019 Ford F-150, wrench in hand, fingers already black to the knuckle, when his phone buzzed against the concrete floor 3 times in a row. Not a text, an actual call. At 6:47 on a Tuesday, he ignored it. It buzzed again. He crawled out, wiped his hands on the shop rag tucked into his belt. Looked at the screen. Unknown number, he answered anyway. Because what's the worst that could happen? Because that thought, right there, is exactly the kind of thing a man says before everything goes sideways. Mr. Smith, not a question. A statement delivered the way people deliver facts they consider beneath discussion. This is Sandra Anderson. A car will collect you in 20 minutes. A pause, not the kind where someone is thinking. The kind where someone is allowing you time to process. Be ready. The line went dead. James stood in the middle of his shop on SE Division Street in Portland, Oregon, and looked at his phone the way a man looks at a grenade with the pin already pulled. The fluorescent light above the tool rack flickered. Oil-stained concrete, hand-lettered sign above the garage door, a 2017 Camry on the lift with a busted CV joint, coffee going cold on the workbench. Sandra Anderson. He knew the name. Everyone in aerospace engineering knew the name. The way everyone in the country knew the name of whoever just bought their house out from under them. He looked at the calendar on the wall. Handwritten note in red marker. Kevin's writing. From 3 days ago. Dad, don't forget. Scholarship results posted today. 20 minutes. James Smith had built his life around solving problems he could actually touch. A failing alternator. A cracked head gasket. Things that broke according to physics, not politics. After Westfield Dynamics collapsed under the weight of a hostile acquisition 3 years ago, he'd taken the severance, taken the tools he'd bought himself, and opened a 2-bay shop on a street that smelled like coffee and rain and diesel. It wasn't what he'd planned, but it was his. Every invoice, every oil change, every brake job done right the first time his. The morning before Harlow Aerospace Systems absorbed Westfield and erased 47 jobs including his, James had been presenting electromagnetic shielding specs to a room full of people who stopped listening halfway through his 3rd slide. That was a Thursday. On the Friday, he cleaned out his desk. On the following Monday, his wife Laura sat across from him at the kitchen table and told him, in a voice that was very careful and very controlled, what the oncologist had said. Pancreatic. Stage 3. Some weeks feel like a lifetime. That one felt like a door slamming. He'd sold the house in Beaverton, used the equity to open the shop. Something with flexible hours. Something that meant he could take Laura to chemo on Tuesdays and Thursdays and still make rent. She lasted 16 months. Long enough to see him fix his first transmission on his own. Long enough to tell their son, Kevin, who was 17 at the time, that his father was the most stubborn man she'd ever met, and that was probably going to save both of them. She was right about the stubborn part. Kevin was 20 now, enrolled at Portland Community College, engineering prerequisites, working nights at a logistics warehouse on the east side because his father had taught him, by example rather than lecture, that you carry your own weight. James paid what he could toward tuition. Kevin never complained about the rest. They had a system, not a comfortable one, but it functioned, which is what James Smith knew how to do. Function. He went to the sink, scrubbed his hands. The grease never came all the way out anymore, embedded in the fine lines of his knuckles like a second skin. He changed his shirt, put on the cleanest jacket hanging by the door, the dark blue one with the small tear in the left pocket he kept meaning to fix. Locked the shop, stepped outside into the gray Portland morning. The car arrived in 18 minutes. Not 20. A black Mercedes S-Class, not a town car, not a fleet rental. Someone's personal vehicle, driven by a man in a dark jacket who did not introduce himself, did not make eye contact, and opened the rear door with the practiced silence of someone who considered conversation a form of inefficiency. James got in. The leather smelled like money, not new car money, old money. The kind that doesn't need to announce itself. He watched his shop disappear in the side mirror as the car turned north. The Anderson estate sat at the end of a private road off SW Fairmount Boulevard, elevated above the city in the way that wealth always elevates itself, literally and otherwise. The house was modern in the specific way that architecture becomes when budget is irrelevant glass and raw concrete and horizontal lines that said we have transcended the need for warmth. It didn't look like a home, it looked like a conviction. A woman met him at the front door, not Sandra Anderson, an assistant, young and efficient, who walked him through a foyer where the floor was polished concrete and the art on the wall was the kind that made you feel like you were missing something obvious. She left him in a sitting room off the main corridor. James stood rather than sat. Habit. In a room like this, sitting felt like a concession. The walls told a story. Forbes covers, a Fortune 500 recognition plaque from 4 years back. A framed photograph of a ribbon cutting at a facility he didn't recognize. Sandra Anderson front and center in a hard hat that somehow looked tailored. An Industry Innovation Award from the Aviation Technology Council, presented the same year. Harlow Aerospace swallowed Westfield Dynamics whole and chewed through 47 careers without pausing to taste them. He was still looking at that award when she walked in. Sandra Anderson was 44 years old and carried it the way certain women carry difficult decades, not by pretending they didn't happen, but by letting them sharpen everything. She was tall. Dark brown hair pulled back from a face that was striking in its precision. Cheekbones and jaw and gray eyes that assessed a room the way James assessed an engine, quickly, thoroughly, already calculating what needed fixing. She wore a charcoal blazer over dark pants and moved across the room without a single wasted gesture. She did not extend her hand. "Mr. Smith," she gestured toward the sitting area overlooking the terrace. "Coffee." Not a question. An offer stated as fact, the way she apparently stated everything. "Sure." He sat, because refusing felt like a different kind of concession. She poured from a carafe on the side table, handed him a cup without looking to confirm he'd accepted it, poured her own, remained standing. The terrace beyond the glass showed Portland spread out below them, the city still half wrapped in morning cloud, the river a gray ribbon in the distance. "My daughter mentioned you," Sandra said. James waited. He had learned, in 3 years of running a small business, that the person who talks first in a silence usually loses something. "Nicole." Sandra set her coffee down on the table between them and picked up a folder that had been sitting there already. Prepared. She'd known exactly where this conversation was going before he walked through the door. "You assisted her 2 weeks ago, off Burnside near the Lads Addition neighborhood. Her vehicle had a tire failure," he remembered. A silver Audi A4 passenger side rear on a wet Tuesday evening. The girl was early 20s, pulled over neatly despite the flat, hazards on, already on her phone, when he noticed her, from the parking lot of the hardware store he'd stopped at for brake line fittings. He'd had a plug kit in the truck. It took 11 minutes. "She seemed capable," James said. "I just had the equipment." "She said you refused payment." It was 11 minutes. Sandra looked at him then. Not the quick professional assessment from the doorway. Something slower, like she was recalibrating something. She opened the folder and slid a document across the coffee table. Clean paper, crisp edges, a contract. Harlow Aerospace Systems, Fleet Vehicle Maintenance Services, Exclusive Provider Agreement. He looked at the retainer figure on page 1 and felt his face do nothing. Because he'd learned years ago that reacting to numbers in front of people who use numbers as weapons is a losing strategy. It was more than 3 times his average monthly revenue. "Harlow operates 14 vehicles in the Portland metro area," Sandra said. "Executive fleet, field vehicles, 2 specialty transports. Our current provider charges a premium for mediocre service and has missed 3 scheduled maintenance windows in the past 8 months. Your qualifications exceed theirs." James looked at the contract, then at her. "You pulled my qualifications. I research people I consider doing business with. How thoroughly?" A pause. Slight. Almost imperceptible. Thoroughly enough. He should have picked up the pen. The number on that page would cover 3 months of overhead, 2 months of Kevin's tuition, and a meaningful dent in the medical debt that Laura's final year had accumulated. The kind of debt that sits in the back of your mind at 2 in the morning and whispers about interest rates. He didn't pick up the pen, Miss Anderson. He leaned back slightly, not aggressive, just settled, the posture of a man who has learned not to be rushed by money. I appreciate the offer, but I'd like to understand it before I agree to it. A woman who runs a company this size doesn't personally arrange a car to collect a mechanic at 6:47 in the morning because she's unhappy with her current oil change vendor. Something moved across Sandra Anderson's face. Not quite a smile, not quite irritation. Something in between, like the expression of a person who has been handed an equation they didn't expect to find interesting. She picked up her coffee, looked out at the city, took her time with it. My daughter, she said finally, doesn't trust people easily. She hasn't for several years. A beat. She spoke well of you. In my experience, that's rarer than competence. James let that settle. He thought about Nicole in the rain on Burnside. Hazards, blinking, the way she'd watched him work without hovering. Without the anxious over-explanation people sometimes do when a stranger is doing them a favor. She'd been quiet in a way that wasn't shyness. More like someone accustomed to observing before deciding. I'll take the contract, he said. I want 2 days to review the terms before I sign. Sandra Anderson looked at him with the expression of a woman for whom the word negotiate carried personal affront. The terms are standard. Standard for your previous vendor. I have different overhead structures. He picked up the document, folded it once, and placed it in the inside pocket of his jacket. I'll call your office by Thursday, he stood. She stood too, automatically, and something shifted not in her composure, which remained entirely intact, but in the quality of her attention, like she'd mentally reassigned him to a different category. Thursday, she said. Thursday, he confirmed. The driver appeared from somewhere without being summoned. James followed him back through the concrete foyer, past the framed awards, and out into a Portland morning that was starting to smell like rain again. In the car heading back toward Division Street, he sat very still and thought about how Sandra Anderson had not once mentioned why her daughter was in the Lads Edition neighborhood on a Tuesday evening. A neighborhood with no Harlow Aerospace offices, no commercial facilities of note, nothing that would explain the presence of a CEO's daughter in an Audi A4 at 7:30 at night. He thought about that for the entire drive back. Nicole Torres showed up at his shop 2 days later, on a Thursday morning 20 minutes before the time James had agreed to call Sandra's office, which was not a coincidence. She was 21, taller than he remembered, with light brown hair pulled back in a ponytail that managed to look both practical and completely effortless, gray-green eyes that were more alert than comfortable, the eyes of someone who had learned to track exits. She wore dark jeans, a plain burgundy jacket, carried a canvas bag over one shoulder, and walked into the shop with the specific energy of someone who had rehearsed what they were about to do and was now slightly annoyed that they had to do it. Mr. Smith. She looked around the shop, the organized tool racks, the lift, the whiteboard with the week's job list. My mother called you, she did? She sent a car? She did. Nicole nodded, slow, like this confirmed something she'd suspected but found mildly offensive anyway. She doesn't do anything without a reason. Neither do I. James set down the torque wrench he'd been holding, gave her his full attention. What can I do for you, Miss Torres? She put the canvas bag on his workbench, opened it, pulled out a piece of paper. Not a printout, not a photocopy, the original. Folded in thirds, worn at the creases the way something gets when it's been unfolded and refolded many times by hands that couldn't stop checking to make sure it was still real. She held it out. He took it, unfolded it, an email, printed from an inbox, the headers intact. Sent address miller@harlowers.com, recipient the same address, self-addressed. Sent on a Saturday 3 years ago at 11:43 in the evening. Subject line, memo to self, 4 lines, Project Dawnbreaker. Wrong hands. I have the proof. Nicole knows where. James read it twice, looked up at her. Nicole's jaw was set in the way jaws set when the person wearing it has decided they are done crying about something and has moved into the phase that comes after. My father, she said, is Richard Miller. He was CFO of Harlow Aerospace for 9 years, before the divorce. Before she stopped, reset. 3 years ago, he was shot twice in the parking structure of the Harlow Aerospace main campus. 7:15 on a Monday evening. The Portland Police Bureau classified it as an attempted robbery. The suspect was never identified. James held the paper carefully. He survived, he survived. Something flickered in her voice. Controlled but present. Traumatic brain injury, right temporal lobe, he can walk, he can dress himself, he doesn't know my name. A pause that was brief and precise and cost her something. He looks at me like I'm someone he might have met once, at a party, years ago, and he's being polite, because he was raised to be polite. The shop was quiet, except for the ambient sound of Division Street outside. A bus. Someone's stereo. What is Project Dawnbreaker? James asked. I don't know exactly. That's when Nicole pulled a second sheet from the bag, a screenshot, this one, of what appeared to be a corporate budget allocation table. Several line items highlighted in yellow. Dad had been flagging budget anomalies in the aerospace division for months before he was shot. R&D expenditures that didn't correspond to any documented development program. Money moving through internal accounts in ways that technically followed protocol but didn't make operational sense. He couldn't find the project in any official documentation. No board authorization, no regulatory filings. James looked at the budget sheet. His engineer's brain, the part that had spent 12 years at Westfield tracking systems and tolerances, woke up and started mapping the numbers. Something about the allocation pattern, the regularity of it, the size of the increments, the way it was distributed across multiple budget codes made the back of his neck prickle. How long has this been going on? He asked. Best I can reconstruct 4 years, maybe a little more. And your mother doesn't know what it is. Nicole looked at him with an expression that was not quite bitter and not quite tired and was somehow both. My mother built that company from a defense subcontracting firm with 11 employees into a 500-person operation with federal contracts in 4 states. She knows every line of every budget she's ever approved. A beat. Whether she knows what Dawnbreaker is and what she's told me about knowing are 2 separate questions. James folded the email printout and held it out to return it. She shook her head, wanted him to keep it, which told him something. Why me? He asked, the same question he'd asked her mother, expecting a different answer. He got one. Nicole looked at him steadily. Because you fixed my tire in the rain and wouldn't take $20 for it. Because when I tried to push the money on you, you said you'd done the same thing 3 times that week, and you weren't keeping score. She paused. My father used to say that you can tell more about a person from what they don't take than from what they do. Another pause, shorter. I've been trying to find someone outside the company to help me understand what's in those files. Everyone I've approached either works for my mother, or is afraid of my mother, or wants something from my mother. You're the first person I've met in 8 months who doesn't seem to know she exists until she called you. She called me, James pointed out, and now you're here. She called you for her reasons. Nicole held his gaze. I'm here for mine. James looked at the email in his hand. At the 4 lines that someone had typed to themselves at 11:43 on a Saturday night. The way you type something to yourself when you know it might be the last chance you get to leave a trail. He put it in his shirt pocket. No promises, he said. I'll look at what you have. Something in Nicole's shoulders released by approximately 3 degrees, which for her, he was already beginning to understand, was the equivalent of someone else collapsing in relief. He called Sandra's office at 10:15 and left a message that he needed until the following Monday to review the contract terms. Her assistant called back in 4 minutes and confirmed Monday was acceptable. He spent the rest of that day finishing the Camry CV joint and rotating tires on a regular customer's Subaru and thinking about budget, allocation tables, and a man who had emailed himself at 11:43 at night because he was afraid he might not get another chance. Kevin came by the shop at noon with sandwiches. That happened maybe twice a month, when Kevin's schedule aligned and he wasn't sleeping off a night shift. He ate perched on the stool James kept near the tool rack, and they talked about the engineering physics class Kevin was taking, which apparently involved a problem set, about electromagnetic fields that Kevin found either fascinating or maddening, depending on which a part of the problem they were discussing. James listened to his son talk about field equations and felt, as he often did in these moments, the specific quiet satisfaction of a thing he'd managed to get right. Kevin was sharp, shaper than James had been at 20, or maybe just sharper at the things that mattered earlier. He had his mother's patience and his father's refusal to let a problem alone. Got something in the mail, Kevin said, around the second half of his sandwich. Casual, too casual, the delivery of someone who has been sitting on news from the Aviation Engineering Scholarship Foundation. James looked up from the brake caliper he was inspecting.
Probably nothing, Kevin said, not convincingly.
Results were supposed to post today. I said probably nothing, Kevin. Kevin looked at his phone, then at his father.
Then he grinned the specific grin that James had first seen on his face at age 4,
when Kevin had managed to disassemble and partially reassemble a toy truck and wanted acknowledgement for the achievement.
Second alternate, he said, which means if 2 people decline or don't qualify for the full amount.
James crossed the shop in 4 steps and pulled his son into a hug that Kevin accepted with the good-natured tolerance of a 20-year-old who was secretly very glad his father was the hugging type.
Second alternate, James said. It's not first, it's second.
Out of a lot. A lot, James agreed. Kevin went back to school. James went back to the caliper. And for about 40 minutes, the shop was just a shop and the problems in it were the only problems that existed.
Then the bell above the door chimed and Robert Williams walked in.
James recognized the type before he registered the face.
50, maybe 52.
Silver hair maintained at a length that said groomed without appearing to try. Bespoke suit the color of deep charcoal, the kind of fit you only get from someone who came to your house to measure you.
Shoes that had never touched a parking lot without careful navigation.
Everything about him said position. Not wealth exactly, position.
The specific tailoring of a man who has spent decades walking into rooms and watching other people adjust.
He walked in and looked around the shop with the particular expression of a person who is choosing to find the modest surroundings charming rather than inadequate,
like a man visiting a quaint rural restaurant and deciding to enjoy the experience rather than wishing he were somewhere better. Mr. Smith, his voice was warm. Practiced warm, but genuinely skilled at it. He extended his hand.
Robert Williams, Chief Financial Officer, Harlow Aerospace Systems.
James shook the hand, dry, firm, brief, the handshake of a man who has given it 10,000 times. Didn't expect company today, James said. I was in the area.
Williams moved deeper into the shop, hands settling into his trouser pockets, gaze traveling over the tool racks with what appeared
to be appreciative interest.
Harlow operates several facilities on this side of the river. I make a point of familiarizing myself with the surrounding businesses when we bring on new vendors.
He turned back with an easy smile. Particularly when Ms. Anderson herself initiates the relationship.
I like to know who we're dealing with. She mentioned you were reviewing the contract, James said.
Neutral. Nothing in it.
Of course, of course. Williams stopped near the workbench. His eyes moved across the surface tools arranged by size and function. A coffee mug with a chip in the rim, the yellow legal pad where James jotted notes. You were at Westfield Dynamics
before our acquisition.
That's in my resume. Electromagnetic systems.
Propulsion applications.
A couple of filed patents in thermal dissipation for high current circuits. He said it conversationally, the way you mention weather. Impressive work. The cooling system design you submitted for the NV340 project was genuinely innovative.
It was a shame that particular initiative didn't survive the transition.
Something cold moved through James that he did not allow onto his face.
That project had been confidential. Internal Westfield documentation. Never published, never patent abandoned during the acquisition when the new ownership decided it didn't fit their development roadmap. The fact that Williams knew about it meant either he'd had access to Westfield's internal archives post-acquisition, which was possible, or he'd been watching James specifically, which was something else entirely. A lot of good work didn't survive the transition, James said.
Steady Williams smiled again. The kind of smile that acknowledges the implied criticism without accepting it. Change is always difficult, for everyone. He let that breathe for a moment. Then your son Kevin, is it?
Community college, engineering track.
Night shift at Morrison Logistics on the east side.
He paused. The pause of a man who is letting you hear exactly how much he knows.
Smart kid. Hope he has good opportunities ahead of him. The words were warm. The subtext was a fire alarm.
James looked at Robert Williams, his easy posture, his perfect suit, his comfortable smile, and understood with the clarity
that comes from having spent 3 years learning to read the difference between what a situation appears to be and what it actually is,
that this was not a courtesy visit.
This was a calibration. Williams was here to see what James would do with the information that Harlow Aerospace Systems had just offered him a significant contract. Whether he would be grateful and manageable, or whether he would be something else.
Kevin's doing well, James said.
Thanks for asking. Williams placed a business card on the workbench.
Precise center placement, the gesture of a man who does things with intention. Always happy to discuss any questions or concerns you have about the contract. Sandra's judgment is sound, but she can move quickly on things that merit more deliberate consideration. A beat. Don't hesitate to reach out. He left. The shop felt different after he was gone. Not bigger, not smaller. Just observed. James picked up the business card. Williams, Robert G. Chief Financial Officer. The card stock was heavier than it needed to be. He put it in the drawer under the register. He stood very still for a moment in his shop on SE Division Street, listening to the traffic outside, and thought about a man who had emailed himself at 11:43 at night, and a parking structure, shooting that the Portland Police Bureau had, filed as a robbery, and a budget allocation table with line items that didn't add up to any documented project. And he thought about Kevin's grin when he said second alternate. The two thoughts did not coexist comfortably. The Tesla Model S arrived Monday morning at 8 sharp, delivered by a man in a dark jacket who handed James a sealed envelope containing diagnostic access codes and a single laminated card listing the vehicle specifications and service requirements expected by close of business. The driver departed in a waiting vehicle. No conversation, no signature required. James worked methodically. He always did. A complete diagnostic first, systems review, then the physical inspection, then the scheduled maintenance items. He connected his laptop to the vehicle's diagnostic port and began pulling data. It was a beautiful piece of engineering. He could appreciate that without complication. The software architecture was elegant, the battery management system sophisticated in ways that reflected genuine innovation. He spent a longer time with it than he billed for. Because that was his nature. When something was engineered well, he wanted to understand why. He found the anomaly in the secondary systems tray. It was tucked behind the legitimate telematics module, connected via a secondary harness that mirrored the primary data feed. If you didn't know what the factory configuration looked like, and most service technicians wouldn't, unless they'd worked specifically with Tesla's internal schematics, you would see a component and assume it belonged. It was installed by someone who understood both the vehicle's architecture and the art of concealment. James pulled up the Tesla technical specifications on his laptop, cross-referenced the component against the documented module list, went back to the physical installation, back to the specs. The component was not factory. It was not a licensed third-party add-on. It was custom-built, which meant it had been designed specifically for this purpose and this installation. He took photographs, methodical documentation, the way he'd been trained to document anomalies in engineering projects, multiple angles, close-ups of the connection points, the transmission module, the power draw indicators. He noted the component's approximate dimensions, the quality of the manufacturing, the specific connector types used. Then he sat back on the creeper and looked at the undercarriage of Sandra Anderson's personal vehicle and thought carefully about what he was looking at. This was not a stolen vehicle tracker. Those were smaller, simpler, designed for one function. This was multi-channel. He could see at least 3 separate output lines from the module, suggesting different types of data being captured simultaneously. Location was the obvious one. But the secondary and tertiary outputs ran to components near the microphone array and the vehicle's cellular radio system. Ambient audio, communication intercept, someone had installed, in the CEO of Harlow Aerospace Systems' personal Tesla, a device that was almost certainly capturing her conversations and transmitting them to a receiver he couldn't see. He sat in the shop for a long time. The phone on the workbench buzzed. Text from Nicole, did the car arrive? He typed back, yes, working on it now. 3 dots appeared, disappeared, appeared again. Then, can I come by this afternoon? He looked at the Tesla, at the photographs on his phone, at the business card in the drawer under the register. Sure, he wrote. He finished the scheduled maintenance first. Did the work he was paid to do, thoroughly and correctly, because that was who he was. Then he photographed the anomalous component from 6 additional angles, transferred everything to his laptop, and put the laptop in the locked cabinet where he kept his most sensitive paperwork. Then he called Brian Thompson. Brian answered on the second ring, in the particular way of someone who had been half expecting the call. James had known Brian for 11 years. They'd overlapped at Westfield for 4 of them. Before Brian moved into cybersecurity consulting, took his particular skill set for finding things people didn't want found, and built a small but apparently successful practice out of it. He was 44. Methodical in his thinking, and one of the 3 people James trusted without qualification. One of the 3 remaining, after Laura. Need to talk to you about something professional, James said. Secure line preferred. Is this the kind of thing I want to know about? Brian's voice carried the particular tone of someone who is already calculating odds. Probably not. Kelsey's diner tonight. I'll bring the signal kit. James hung up and looked at the Tesla sitting in his shop bay, sleek and silver and full of someone else's secrets. And for the first time since Sandra Anderson's car had appeared outside his shop a week ago, he let himself acknowledge what his gut had been telling him since that morning. He was already in this, whether he'd agreed to be or not. The question was not whether to get involved. The question was what kind of person he was going to be while it happened. He thought about Laura, about what she would say. She would say, and he could hear it exactly. Her voice, the particular patience she had when she was waiting for him to arrive at an obvious conclusion. She would say that the most important decisions aren't the ones where you choose between good and bad. They're the ones where you choose between safe and right. She had been right about the stubborn part. He pulled out his phone and texted Nicole, "See you at 3. Then he went back to work. She came in at 2:58. He was cleaning up from the Tesla job when the bell chimed. She had the same canvas bag over her shoulder, and the same quality of attention that he was starting to recognize as simply how she moved through the world. Careful but not timid. Like someone who had learned to look before committing to a direction and had no plans to unlearn that. She saw his expression before he said anything. "You found something," Nicole said. He turned his laptop around and showed her the photographs. She looked at them for a long time. Her breathing didn't change. Her expression didn't change, which meant he was coming to understand that something had changed significantly on the inside, and she was choosing how to handle it before it reached her face. "Someone is monitoring her," she said finally. "Not a question. Professionally installed. This isn't an off-the-shelf product. Whoever put this in Sandra Anderson's car had custom equipment and knew exactly what they were doing." Nicole looked at the photograph of the transmission module for another moment. Then she looked up at him. "My father said he had proof. The email says Nicole knows where. I don't know where. He never told me directly." A pause. "But he gave me something 3 weeks before he was shot. A small USB drive in a locket on a chain. He told me to wear it every day and not tell my mother." I thought she stopped, breathed, reset. "I thought it was a sentimental thing." He was sentimental. "I didn't open it because it felt like a test of whether I would trust him." James looked at her. "I have it," she said. "I've never opened it. I've been wearing it for 3 years." The fluorescent light above the tool rack hummed. Outside, Division Street moved through its afternoon rhythms. A woman with a stroller, a delivery truck, a city proceeding as if nothing was happening. "I have a contact," James said. "Someone who can analyze the component in the Tesla. Tell us who manufactured it. Tell us where the signal is going." Nicole nodded. "This isn't a small thing," he said, because she needed to hear it from him directly, not piece it together later. If the filing was right about Dawnbreaker, if someone shot your father to stop him from talking, then whatever is in that drive, he paused. They might already know about you. They put surveillance in your mother's car. That's not the action of someone who has moved on. She held his gaze without flinching, which told him everything he needed to know about the 3 years she had been carrying this alone. "I know," Nicole said. James Smith looked at the photographs on his laptop, at the email in his shirt pocket that began Project Dawnbreaker, wrong hands, at the business card in the drawer that belonged to a man who had mentioned his son's GPA as if it were casual conversation. He thought about Kevin saying second alternate in the voice of someone trying to downplay something that mattered enormously to him. He thought about Laura telling him that the important decisions were the ones between safe and right. He closed the laptop, picked up his phone. 7 o'clock, he said. "I'll text you the address." Kelsey's diner occupied a corner of S.E. Hawthorne that the rest of Portland had decided not to gentrify, which was probably why Brian Thompson had been using it as a meeting point for 6 years. Vinyl booths. Fluorescent lighting that didn't flatter anyone. Coffee that tasted like it had been brewed sometime before the current administration and kept warm out of stubbornness. A counter staffed by a woman named Dot, who had heard everything and remembered nothing. The kind of place where a signal jammer on a table looked like someone's external hard drive and nobody cared enough to look twice. Brian was already in the back booth when James arrived. Laptop open, small black device beside it that hummed at a frequency just below audible. He looked up with the expression of a man who had agreed to something before fully thinking it through, and was now fully thinking it through. He looked at James, then at Nicole, who had come in 30 seconds behind, then back at James. "You brought company," Brian said. "She's the reason we're here." "Is she Nicole Torres, Richard Miller's daughter?" Brian closed his laptop halfway, looked at Nicole with a different kind of attention. The attention of a man recalibrating what kind of evening this was going to be. Nicole slid into the booth across from him without being invited because she had stopped waiting for invitations approximately 3 years ago. "What did you bring me?" Brian asked. James put his phone on the table. The photographs from the Tesla. Brian pulled the phone toward him, swiped through without comment, swiped back, zoomed in on the transmission module, zoomed in on the connection points. Dot came by. James ordered coffee. Nicole ordered tea. Brian looked up long enough to say he was fine and went back to the photographs. 3 minutes of silence, which is a long time in a diner booth when you are waiting to find out how bad something is. Brian set the phone down, folded his hands on the table, looked at James with the expression of someone who has arrived at a conclusion they would have preferred not to arrive at. "This isn't commercial hardware. I know. This is purpose-built, custom fabrication." The transmission module, he tapped the phone screen, that connector configuration, that specific pinout. "I've seen exactly one system that uses that arrangement." A pause. "It's not something you buy, it's something you commission, from someone with access to components that aren't in any civilian supply chain." Nicole's voice was level. "Who commissions something like that?" "Someone with money, someone with connections to defense-adjacent manufacturing. Someone who needs information badly enough to invest in the infrastructure for collecting it." Brian looked at her. "And someone who wanted it installed in a specific vehicle. This wasn't opportunistic. This was targeted." James watched Nicole absorb that. She didn't react visibly. She just became slightly more still, the way water becomes still right before it freezes. "Can you trace where the signal goes?" James asked. Brian opened his laptop all the way. "With the photographs alone, I can narrow it to a manufacturer class and transmission protocol. To trace the actual destination, I'd need either direct access to the device or a receiver that's already intercepting the signal." He paused. "Or I'd need to know the IP range of whatever server it's sending to. Which means I'd need to know what network to look inside." Nicole reached into her bag, put a folded document on the table. Budget allocation sheet, the same one she'd shown James in the shop, plus 3 additional pages he hadn't seen, printouts of internal Harlow Aerospace network architecture. The kind of documentation that does not leave company premises without someone making a significant decision. Brian looked at the pages, then at Nicole. "Where did you get internal network documentation?" "My father kept copies of everything." She held Brian's gaze without difficulty. "He was the CFO. He designed the financial architecture and signed off on the IT infrastructure budget for 6 consecutive years. He kept redundant documentation because he said that was what responsible financial officers did, and also because he didn't entirely trust cloud." A beat. He was right about the cloud. Brian looked at the network documentation for a long time. Nobody spoke. Dot refilled James's coffee without being asked and moved on. Then Brian said, "The transmission frequency you'd expect from a device like this, given the hardware configuration," he pointed to a specific photograph, "would most likely operate through a proprietary encrypted channel, but it has to land somewhere. A server, a receiving station." He cross-referenced something on his laptop with the network architecture sheet, then stopped moving entirely. James recognized that particular stillness, the stillness of an engineer who has found something. "It's internal," Brian said. "What?" "The signal." He turned the laptop around, a network diagram, a specific node highlighted. "Based on the IP range in this architecture document and the transmission parameters visible in the photographs, the signal from the device in Sandra Anderson's car is routing to a server inside Harlow Aerospace's own network." He pointed to the highlighted node, specifically to a server cluster registered under the financial division. Another point, with administrative credentials assigned to the CFO's office. Nicole's cup hit the table harder than she intended. Not much harder, but enough. Robert Williams. The name landed in the space between the 3 of them like something dropped from a height. Nobody said it out loud for a moment, because saying something out loud moves it from theory to fact, and facts require responses. Nicole said it, quietly, without inflection. Williams has been listening to my mother's private conversations. If this analysis is correct, not aggressive, just certain, in the way she was certain about most things once she'd examined them from enough angles. He's been inside the company longer than I've been alive. He knows the network infrastructure. He has the connections and the budget authority to commission custom hardware. A pause, and he was my father's direct report for 4 years before the divorce. The diner moved around them. Someone at the counter laughed at something. The door opened and closed twice. Outside, Hawthorne went on being Hawthorne. James looked at Brian. Can you build something that intercepts the same signal? A parallel receiver. So we capture what he's capturing without him knowing we're there. Brian rubbed his jaw, the expression of a man doing real-time risk assessment. Technically, yes, it would require direct access to the vehicle again. 20 minutes minimum, probably 30 to do it cleanly. And I'd need to be within range of the signal during an active transmission window. He paused, but James, this is the part where I have to say the thing you don't want me to say. Say it anyway. If Williams is using Harlow's internal network to run surveillance on the CEO of Harlow Aerospace, he's not doing it alone. You don't pull something like this off inside a 500-person company without either owning the IT infrastructure or knowing exactly who does. He looked between them. And if he's connected to whatever your father found, he said this to Nicole then, the people who shot Richard Miller 3 years ago are still employed and still operational, and are currently monitoring the woman who runs the company. The silence after that was different from the previous silences. Heavier, the kind that requires you to sit inside it for a moment before you can move. Nicole's voice, when it came, was quiet and precise. Then we need to know what's on the drive, before we do anything else. She reached into the collar of her shirt and pulled out a chain. Simple silver, at the end of it, a locket. Small oval. The kind that was fashionable once and had become the kind of thing you kept not because of the fashion, but because of what was inside. She unclasped it from her neck and set it on the table. 3 years. She had worn it for 3 years and not opened it. She opened it now. Inside, nested in the hollow of the locket's left half, was a micro USB drive no larger than a thumbnail. The right half held a photograph, small enough to require squinting Richard Miller, and a girl who was probably 18 in the photo, both in hiking gear on a trail somewhere in the Cascades, both grinning with the specific abandon of people who have left their phones in the car. Brian took the drive with the care of someone handling a specimen, produced an adapter from his bag, connected it to his laptop. They waited. The drive was encrypted, which was expected. Brian ran his standard decryption tools, which were not standard tools by any civilian definition, and got through the outer shell in 4 minutes. Inside were 2 folders. The first was labeled D11 files, a mix of PDFs and audio recordings. The second was Brian looked at Nicole. You want to open N first? She shook her head. Brian opened the first file in the D folder, a PDF, Internal Harlow Aerospace Financial Documentation R&D Budget Allocations, the same category Nicole had shown James in the shop, but more granular. Ledger entries going back 4 years, with specific transaction codes highlighted in digital yellow. Below each highlighted entry, a typed note in Richard Miller's voice, methodical, detailed, the notations of an accountant who has been trained to find exactly the kind of discrepancy nobody wants found. 4 years of money moving through Harlow Aerospace R&D budget in amounts large enough to matter and distributed across enough line items to avoid triggering. Automated flags. The cumulative total, when James added the column in his head, was somewhere north of $40 million. Going to a project called Dawnbreaker, with no board authorization, no regulatory filing, no documentation in any official company record. The audio files were Richard Miller reading his own findings aloud. Methodical, calm. The voice of a man who understood that the written record might not survive but a recording might, or vice versa, and so he had made both. The last audio file was different, not a recitation. A conversation Miller and another voice male, professionally modulated, the kind of voice that belonged to conference rooms and earnings calls. Williams. James recognized it from the shop visit. Even at low volume through a laptop speaker in a diner, the cadence was unmistakable. The conversation lasted 4 minutes and 20 seconds. Williams did not discuss Dawnbreaker by name, but he discussed, in the elliptical language of a man who was careful, even in what he assumed were private settings, the timeline for a technology demonstration. A buyer review. A deadline that corresponded, when James cross-referenced it against the dates in the financial files, to approximately 6 weeks from now. $40 million. A weaponized electromagnetic pulse system built inside the shell of a legitimate aerospace company. A CFO who had been in position for 12 years and knew every seam in the financial architecture. And a demonstration deadline 6 weeks out. Brian closed the audio file. Nobody spoke for a moment. Brian opened the second folder, one file, a text document, short. Nicole, if you're reading this, it means I didn't make it to the meeting I was trying to get to. Don't be scared. Be careful. Everything you need is in the other folder, but the piece that matters most isn't in the files. It's in the facility on the east side. Building C. The thing they don't want anyone to see. You'll recognize it when you see it because I told you about it once. In the car on the way home from Timberline, and you said it sounded like science fiction. It doesn't anymore. I love you more than anything I built or earned or lost. Don't go alone. Find someone who fixes things. Dad. Nicole read it twice. Then she sat very still and looked at the center of the table, and her face did the thing it did when something significant was happening inside, and she had decided that the inside was the only place it was going to happen. James looked at the last line. Find someone who fixes things. He felt the specific weight of being chosen for something you didn't apply for. He also felt, underneath it, the particular responsibility of being the kind of person who, when handed that weight, was not actually going to put it down. Sandra Anderson walked into Kelsey's diner at 9:17. Not a coincidence. James had already stopped believing in coincidences approximately 48 hours ago, and this was not the moment to reinvent that policy. She came through the door in dark jeans and a plain jacket, hair loose, and looked exactly like herself, only slightly more tired and slightly less armored, which was still formidably composed by any reasonable standard. She scanned the room, found the booth, walked to it with the directness of a woman who had been deciding things for a long time, and was currently deciding several at once. She stopped at the end of the booth, looked at Brian's laptop, the drive adapter, the photographs, her daughter's face. I know what you found in the car, Sandra said. James said, sit down. She sat, across from Brian, next to nobody, occupying the end of the booth, the way she occupied rooms completely, without excess. Brian said, Miss Anderson, I'm Brian Thompson. I know who you are. She looked at him with the gray eyes that had assessed James's shop and found it worth engaging with. Cybersecurity consultant. 12 years in the industry after leaving Westfield Dynamics. You specialize in counter-surveillance and network forensics for corporate clients. A beat. You were James's closest colleague at Westfield. Brian looked at James. She researches people. She mentioned that. Sandra placed both hands flat on the table. My security team detected an anomalous transmission from my vehicle 6 months ago. They couldn't identify the source. 3 months ago, I commissioned an independent investigation that was sufficiently discreet that whoever installed the device hasn't been alerted. She looked at James directly. I hired you because I needed someone to service the vehicle who might recognize what they were looking at. Someone outside the company. Someone whose background included electromagnetic systems. A pause that cost her something. Someone I couldn't offer enough money to make loyalty more valuable than honesty. The last sentence landed in the booth like a stone dropped in still water. Nicole looked at her mother. The look of someone doing a very rapid revision of a very long-held certainty. You knew. I knew something was wrong. I didn't know what or who. Sandra's voice was controlled in the way that very difficult emotions become controlled when you've had long enough to practice. I suspected Williams 2 months ago, when I began tracing certain financial anomalies in the aerospace division. Project Dawnbreaker, James said. A different quality of stillness moved across Sandra's face. Where did you hear that name? Richard Miller. Nicole said it before James could. Steady, watching her mother's face with the intensity of someone who has been waiting a long time to have a real conversation with someone who keeps offering polished ones instead. He left a trail. 3 years ago, the night before he was shot, he emailed himself, and he left me a drive. She nodded toward the laptop. We've been going through it. Sandra looked at the laptop, then at her daughter, and for a moment brief, unguarded. The kind of moment that gets past even the most experienced composure. Something moved through her face that was grief and guilt and relief in proportions too tangled to separate. He called me, Sandra said, the night before. He said he needed to meet, that he had documentation. something large enough to take directly to federal oversight. A pause, I thought. She stopped, breathed, started again. We were in the middle of the divorce settlement. Our lawyers were fighting over the equity in the Portland facility. When he called and said he had found something that could expose a major problem in the company, my first instinct, she stopped again. The kind of stop that is not about finding words, but about deciding whether to say the truth. My first instinct was that he was building leverage. For the settlement, the diner, dot at the counter, the fluorescent lights. All of it went very quiet in the specific way that things go quiet when someone says out loud the thing that has been sealed inside them for years. Nicole's voice was almost without inflection. You didn't take the meeting. I told him Thursday. He was shot Monday. Sandra did not look away from her daughter. I have thought about those 4 days every day for 3 years. The silence between them was not the silence of people who had nothing to say. It was the silence of people who had too much and didn't know which piece to start with. James sat in it with them and thought about Laura in the hospital in the last weeks. And the nights he hadn't come because he was too tired, or too afraid, or too convinced there would be another chance. And he thought that this diner booth contained more than enough grief for one table. Brian cleared his throat. Quietly. There's a facility. He turned the laptop around and showed them the text document from Richard Miller's N folder. Building C East Side. Sandra read it. Her jaw tightened. The R&D secondary facility on Sandy Boulevard. Harlow Aerospace leases the building under a logistics company name. It's not in any public documentation. Even most senior staff don't know it exists. She looked at Brian. If Dawnbreaker is physically operational, if there's a working prototype, that's where it would be. What is it? Brian asked specifically. Sandra was quiet for a moment. The quiet of someone deciding how much to confirm. Then a directed electromagnetic pulse delivery system. Portable, precision targeted to a defined radius. Capable of disabling specific categories of electronic infrastructure without physical destruction of surrounding structures. She paused. It was a theoretical concept in our aerospace division 4 years ago. An internal research project that I shut down when the regulatory review indicated it would require federal weapons development licensing we weren't equipped to pursue. Another pause. Apparently it didn't stay shut down. Brian said, almost to himself, $40 million buys a lot of continued development. Williams has been inside the financial architecture for 12 years, Sandra said. He designed parts of it. If he wanted to hide $40 million inside our R&D budget, he knew exactly where to put it, so that only someone who understood the structure from the beginning would find it. She looked at Nicole. Like your father. Nicole said, we need to go to the facility. James said, not tonight. Nicole looked at him with the eyes of someone who has been patient for 3 years and has run out of reasons to keep being patient. My father wrote Building C. Whatever is in there is what he was trying to expose. It's the physical evidence. The financial files show the money. The audio shows Williams. But the prototype is what makes it real. What makes it something a federal prosecutor can stand in front of a jury with. I understand that, James said. And I also understand that Williams has had 3 years, since your father was shot, to make sure whatever is in that facility is protected by something more significant than a standard lock. He looked at Sandra. What does the security look like? Sandra pulled out her phone, brought up a schematic that she should not have been able to access on a restaurant table, and that James suspected she had prepared before walking into this diner. Which meant she had been planning this specific conversation for longer than the last 20 minutes. 3-tier perimeter. Motion sensors. Camera array. Building access via biometric authentication, hand geometry, and retinal scan. Internal compartmentalization with varying clearance tiers. She looked at the screen. Williams has full clearance. I have oversight clearance that technically supersedes his. Whether that access has been revoked or compromised depends on what he's done to the authentication system in the last 6 months. He's been listening to your conversations for 6 months, Brian said. If he heard anything that made him think you were getting close, he may have already taken steps. Sandra set the phone down, which is why time matters. James looked at his phone. 10:43. Kevin would be starting his shift at Morrison Logistics in 40 minutes. He texted quickly, checking in, "How are you?" and got back a thumbs up with a coffee cup emoji, which meant Kevin was fine and about to start a long night and wasn't expecting trouble. Good. Give me 48 hours, James said. Brian needs time to build the intercept receiver, I need to look at the building's technical specification, HVAC design, electrical layout, anything that tells me about the construction. And we need to know exactly who else at Harlow is in Williams's network before we walk into that facility. Nicole looked like she wanted to argue, chose not to, because she was, under the urgency, a rational person. 48 hours. Sandra looked at James with the gray eyes that assessed things quickly and rarely reassessed them. And then, James thought about what Brian had said. Someone with money, someone with connections. Someone who needed information badly enough to build the infrastructure to collect it. He thought about Richard Miller reading financial ledgers into a voice recorder at 11:43 on a Saturday night, because he understood that whatever he'd found was worth dying for, or at least worth the risk of it. Then we go get what your father left, he said to Nicole, and we make sure it gets to the right people before Williams has his demonstration. The 48 hours were not quiet. 14 hours in, Williams called. James was under the Camry. He'd been neglecting the one with the CV joint that had been waiting patiently on the lift. For days when the shop phone rang, he answered Mr. Smith. The warm voice, still warm, maybe slightly less easily warm than in the shop. I understand you've been working on Sandra's vehicle. Completed service Monday. Invoice was submitted. Of course. A pause with texture in it. I also understand you had dinner with a mutual acquaintance last night, Brian Thompson, cybersecurity consultant. Another pause. Portland is a small city in certain ways. James's hand tightened on the phone. He kept his voice the same. I have old colleagues. I try to stay in touch. Admirable. Williams let the words sit. I wanted to follow up on our earlier conversation. About the contract. About the appropriate management of any concerns that come up in the course of working with a new client. A beat. Sandra has many fine qualities, but she's been under considerable pressure lately. The board has concerns about her decision-making. I'd hate for a new vendor relationship to get complicated by a difficult period in the company's internal dynamics. James was quiet for a long moment. Robert, he said. First name. Deliberate. I fix cars. That's what the contract says. That's what I'm doing. A pause, of course. The warmth had a different quality now. Still there, but thinner. Like a coat that's getting worn. I hope we understand each other. We do, James said, and meant it in a way Williams probably didn't intend. He hung up, called Brian. He made me, James said when Brian picked up. How? He knew about last night. Someone either followed me, or he has surveillance in more places than one car. James looked at the street through the shop window. Ordinary Tuesday morning. Bakery truck making a delivery. Guy walking a large dog. How close are you on the intercept receiver? 12 hours. Maybe 10 if I skip sleep. Skip sleep. She picked up on the first ring. Williams called me, James said. A brief silence. What did he say? Nothing direct enough. A pause. He's watching me. Which means he's watching the situation. Which means 48 hours might be generous. Sandra's voice was controlled. It was always controlled. But there was something underneath it, now, that hadn't been there at the diner, an urgency that she wasn't bothering to fully conceal. The board meeting is Thursday. Williams has scheduled a special session. He told 3 members it's to discuss concerns about my mental fitness for leadership during what he called an erratic period. A pause. He's moving. So are we, James said. He called Nicole last. She answered immediately, as if she had been waiting. Tonight, he said. Not tomorrow, not a question. Not really. Because she had been ready for 3 years, and the only variable was whether the other people in the equation had caught up yet. She said, tell me what time. Brian arrived at the shop at 8 with a case that looked like a photographer's equipment bag and was not. He looked like a man who had skipped sleep and supplemented the deficit with enough coffee to make philosophical decisions about caffeine dependency. He set the case on the workbench and opened it. Inside, nested in foam, a device roughly the size and shape of a thick paperback novel. Clean assembly, compact antenna array folded against the body. Intercept receiver, Brian said. Tuned to the transmission frequency from the vehicle device. If the primary device is active and transmitting, this captures the same feed without interrupting the original signal. Whoever's on the other end keeps receiving. They don't know we're there. James examined it. The engineering was good. Better than good. Range? Within a quarter mile of an active transmission, I get clean data. Further than that, I get fragments. He paused. The device in the Tesla transmits when the vehicle is in motion, and also at scheduled intervals when parked, probably every 4 hours. I'd need to be within range during an active window. Sandra drives the Tesla to the office most mornings, Nicole said. She was sitting on the stool by the tool rack, had been since 7:30, had apparently decided that waiting at home was not a viable option, and nobody had disagreed with her because she was not wrong. She takes SW Barber. I can tell her to take Sandy Boulevard instead. Past the R&D facility. If the device transmits on schedule and Brian is parked somewhere on the route, I pick up the active feed, track it back to the server node, confirm Williams's IP range. Brian looked at James, and we have the chain. Device to server to credentials. Clean evidentiary chain for someone with subpoena power. James nodded, then looked at Nicole. You said Building C. Your father said you'd recognize it because of something he told you on the way home from Timberline. Nicole's expression shifted slightly, the particular shift of someone accessing a specific memory. 3 years ago, maybe 4, we hiked Timberline Trail, part of it, the southern section. On the way back, he was talking about what he called dual-use technology. Civilian development with military application. He said the most dangerous inventions weren't weapons designed as weapons. They were tools designed as tools that someone quietly pointed in the wrong direction. She paused. He described a system that could look like a communications array from the outside. That would be documented as a signal enhancement device in any regulatory filing. But that could, in the right configuration, produce a directed electromagnetic pulse of sufficient magnitude to shut down electronic systems in a defined radius. She paused again. He said it sounded like science fiction. I said it did too. He said it wasn't. The shop was quiet. He was describing Dawnbreaker. Sandra said from the doorway. She had arrived 10 minutes before, let herself in when James left the side door unlocked, and had been listening from the edge of the light. Nobody had asked her not to. The original concept came from our aerospace division. A signal enhancement prototype that our engineers realized, about halfway through development, had an unintended secondary application. She came fully into the room. I shut the program down when I understood what it could become. Or I thought I did. James looked at her. Williams continued it. Without board authorization, without federal licensing, without my knowledge. A pause, precise and honest, or so I have to believe. Nicole looked at her mother across the workbench. I need you to not have known. Sandra held her daughter's gaze. I know you do. Something passed between them that was not resolution, not yet. Not in a shop on a Tuesday night with the pieces still scattered, but was the beginning of a thing. The first cautious step onto ground that might hold. Brian cleared his throat. We should talk about the building. James spread the documentation on the workbench. Brian had pulled public records for the building on Sandy Boulevard, construction permits, utility connections, the logistics company lease. James had spent 6 hours earlier in the day cross-referencing those records against his own knowledge of standard industrial construction practices and, specifically, against the design standards used by the contractor. He recognized from the permit filings the same contractor who had built 2 Westfield Dynamics facilities in the early years, one of which James had helped commission. HVAC access is through the north face, James said. Standard industrial system, probably Carrier or similar. The contractor used Carrier on both Westfield builds. The secondary access shaft runs parallel to the building's east wall and connects to a utility corridor on the sublevel. He pointed. These buildings were built for logistics, not for security. The biometric authentication is on the primary access points. The utility systems are designed to code minimum, which means manual overrides at the mechanical level. Brian said, You're saying we go in through the HVAC. I'm saying that's the route that doesn't require us to defeat biometric authentication. James looked at Sandra. You have clearance to the facility. Theoretical clearance. I've never been inside. If Williams has taken precautions, your biometrics are in the system unless he's had them manually removed, which requires an IT authorization request that would generate a log entry. Brian was already on his laptop. If he removed your access, there's a record. If there's a record, he typed, paused, looked up. Your access hasn't been revoked, as of this afternoon. He didn't think I knew the facility existed, Sandra said. He still doesn't, James said. That's the one advantage we have. Nicole was looking at the schematic. Her finger traced the utility corridor. Building C is the northeast section. Here, she pointed. If the prototype is operational and they're preparing a demonstration, there will be equipment staged, James finished. Technical staff, possibly people who aren't on the official payroll. He straightened. And if Williams knows we're moving, his phone buzzed. Kevin. A call. James answered immediately. Kevin's voice was careful in the way it got when Kevin was trying to sound unconcerned while being considerably concerned. Dad, there's a guy outside, just standing there, by the loading dock. He's been there 40 minutes, and he's not one of the regular security guys. And he keeps looking at his phone in the specific way people look at their phone when they're not actually looking at their phone. The cold that had been sitting at the base of James's skull for the last 48 hours moved down his spine and settled somewhere lower. Okay, James said. Listen carefully. Don't go near him. Don't let on that you've noticed him. Find your supervisor. Tell him you're not feeling well. Clock out. Don't go to the truck. Call a lift from inside and go directly to the apartment. Lock both locks. A pause. Dad. What's happening? James looked at Brian, at Sandra, at Nicole, at the schematic on his workbench and the drive on Brian's laptop and the intercept receiver in its foam case. He thought about Richard Miller emailing himself on a Saturday night. He thought about the 4 days between the phone call and the shooting. He thought about the ways in which not moving fast enough is its own category of decision. I'll explain everything, James said. I promise. Right now, just do what I said. Kevin said, okay, steady, like his mother when something was hard. Okay, Dad. James hung up, looked at the room. Tonight, he said. Not in 48 hours now. Nicole was already picking up her jacket. I know. Brian was closing his laptop, which he did when something became serious enough that the laptop was no longer the primary tool. He looked at James with the expression of a man who had signed up for a conversation and was now enrolled in something considerably larger. I want the record to show, Brian said, that I had a very comfortable Tuesday planned. Nobody laughed, but the tension in the room shifted 1 degree towards something survivable, which was the closest thing to humor available, and they all took it. Sandra looked at James, the gray eyes, the composed face with something real moving underneath it. I've been making decisions alone for a long time, she said. Some of them were wrong, some of cost things I can't recover. A pause. I am asking you, not contracting you, not compensating you. Asking to help me do this right. James Smith looked at Sandra Anderson in his oil-stained shop on SE Division Street, in the city that had been trying to grind him down for 3 years, and thought about the difference between safe and right. He had made that choice already, really. He had made it when he put a printout in his shirt pocket and told a young woman with her father's eyes that he would look at what she had. Get your car, he said to Brian. We need to be moving in 20 minutes. They were moving in 17. Sandra sent the text to her head of security, a man named Paul, who answered only to her, and had never answered to Williams with a single line. Facility B tonight. Confirm you're dark. The response came in 4 minutes. Dark. Which meant Paul had understood something was wrong from the moment Sandra had stopped briefing him through official channels 2 months ago and had been waiting to be useful. Brian drove his own car, the signal equipment in the back seat. Sandra sat in the passenger seat of James's truck. Nicole sat in the back. Nobody talked much. The city moved past the windows, the bridges, the river, the East Side neighborhoods where Portland stopped trying to be curated and became just a city full of people trying to get through Tuesday. The facility on Sandy Boulevard looked exactly like what its lease documents claimed it was. A 3-story industrial building, gray concrete, modest signage for a logistics company that existed primarily as a legal entity. The parking lot was mostly empty. 2 vehicles near the building's south entrance. Lights on the 2nd floor. Brian parked a block north, opened his laptop, waited for the intercept receiver to find the Tesla's active transmission signal. Sandra had driven it here, following Sandy Boulevard as planned. The receiver cycled for 90 seconds. Then it locked. Brian looked at his screen, then at James. It's transmitting. Server destination confirmed, he typed. Same IP node. Williams's administrative credentials. He's receiving right now. A pause and I'm capturing everything he's capturing. Clean chain. Every second of this conversation is being logged on my system with timestamp and source attribution. He looked up. We have him. Not enough. Not yet. The financial files showed the money. The audio showed the planning. The intercept receiver showed the surveillance. But somewhere in Building C on the northeast corner of that facility was $40 million of unauthorized weapons technology, staged for a demonstration in 6 weeks, and until they had the physical evidence, Williams could argue that the files were fabricated and the audio was edited and the surveillance device had been installed by someone else. James looked at the building, at the north face, at the HVAC infrastructure visible on the roofline. He thought about Laura saying the important decisions are the ones between safe and right. He opened the truck door. Nicole got out without being told. Sandra got out. 3 people standing in a parking lot on Sandy Boulevard on a Tuesday night, with the city noise around them, and a building in front of them that held the thing a man had tried to expose 3 years ago before someone shot him in his own company's parking structure. James looked at them both. Stay close, move when I move. If something goes wrong, Sandra's voice was even, nothing is going to go wrong. James appreciated the conviction even while not entirely sharing it. If something goes wrong, Brian has everything he needs. We've already won the evidentiary case. This is about making sure there's no demonstration in 6 weeks. Nicole said, it's also about making sure my father didn't spend 3 years in a room not knowing my name for something that gets buried. James looked at her, then at the building. Then he started walking. The north face of the building looked exactly like what it was supposed to look like, which was the point. Gray concrete. Utility conduit running up the wall in standard industrial configuration. The HVAC intake housing mounted at roof level, accessible via a maintenance ladder bolted to the exterior wall beside the loading dock. James went up first. The ladder was cold. Portland night air carrying that particular bite that comes off the river after 10 p.m. In October, the kind that gets into your collar and stays there. He moved quickly, not recklessly. The way a man moves when he's decided that speed and noise are a worse combination than slow and quiet. The roofline gave him the full layout. 3 HVAC units serving the building's 3 sections. The northeast unit, which served Building C, had an access panel on its south face maintenance access, required by code, secured with a hex bolt that required a tool. He'd brought specifically because he'd seen this exact housing model on the permit drawings and knew what it used. 2 minutes. The panel came free. The secondary access shaft dropped vertically into the building's mechanical interstitial space, then turned horizontal along the east wall toward the utility corridor Richard Miller had described as the route. Not described, had implied. In a note written to a daughter he was trusting to figure out the rest. James looked down into the shaft, looked back at the roofline, looked at Sandy Boulevard below, where Brian's car sat dark and quiet, the intercept receiver logging everything, the evidentiary chain building one timestamp at a time. Then Sandra appeared at the top of the ladder, moving with a competence that should not have surprised him but did slightly, because she moved like someone who had prepared for this. Not recently, for a long time, the kind of preparation that happens quietly over months, fueled by the specific energy of a person who knows something is coming and refuses to be caught unprepared when it does. Nicole came up last, faster than either of them, light on the rungs, the way young people move when urgency finally has somewhere to go after years of waiting. The shaft was tight, single file. James first, then Nicole, then Sandra. Horizontal section was low enough that they moved on hands and knees across the building's mechanical infrastructure, the sound of the HVAC systems around them, creating a consistent white noise that covered everything smaller. Good. Cover was cover regardless of the source. James counted the structural bays. 1, 2, 3. The utility corridor access should be at the 4th bay junction on the east wall. It was. A floor panel with a manual release. He worked it with 2 fingers, slow, controlling the movement to prevent any metallic report. It lifted. Below the utility corridor concrete floor, pipe runs along both walls. Emergency lighting in amber strips at ankle level. Enough to see. Not enough to be seen from a distance. He dropped down, helped Nicole. Sandra landed beside them without needing help and immediately oriented herself, looking both directions down the corridor with the assessment speed of a woman who had walked through difficult rooms her entire professional life and had learned to read them in seconds. East end, then north, she said quietly. Building C junction is through the fire door at the corridor terminus. They moved. The utility corridor was the skeleton of the building. Everything that the public-facing surfaces concealed was visible here: the electrical conduit, the data line runs, the plumbing. James looked at the data lines as they walked. Standard industrial bundles for the first 2 sections. Then something different in the northeast section: heavier gauge conduit, the kind used for high current applications, running alongside a fiber bundle that was not part of the building's original construction. Someone had run additional infrastructure into Building C, significant infrastructure. The kind of electrical capacity you'd need if you were running equipment that drew substantially more power than anything a logistics company would require. The fire door at the corridor terminus had a standard push bar from this side. No card reader, no biometric panel, emergency egress requirement, which meant it opened from the inside regardless of access credentials. James looked at Sandra. She nodded once. He pushed the bar. The door opened into a stairwell. One flight down to the sublevel, one flight up to the main floor. The sublevel was lit not emergency lighting, actual operational lighting, the kind that means people are working, or were recently working. They went up. Main floor first. Assessed. The main floor of Building C was dark except for standby indicator lights on equipment racks along the far wall. James took it in. Not a storage space, not a logistics operation. An active workspace, workbenches, test equipment, computational hardware, the organized infrastructure of an engineering program that had been running for years. The bench surfaces were clean in the way that active programs are clean. Not dusty, not abandoned. Nicole stopped 3 steps into the room. Against the north wall, occupying a space roughly the size of 2 parking spaces, sat the prototype. It didn't look like a weapon. It looked like a signal array, a central tower structure with articulated antenna elements, surrounded by control hardware and a power conditioning unit the size of a refrigerator. Clean fabrication, professional engineering, the kind of thing that, in different documentation, could be described as exactly what Richard Miller had told his daughter on the way home from Timberline, a signal enhancement device. Dual-use technology pointed in the wrong direction. Nicole stood in front of it and looked at it for a long moment. Then he described it exactly. James was already moving to the documentation station adjacent to the prototype. Physical documentation, because serious engineering programs always maintained physical records alongside digital ones. Binders, printed specifications, test logs. He opened the most recent test log. The entries were dated. The most recent was 4 days ago. Performance metrics, calibration data, range confirmation testing. The kind of documentation that, combined with everything Brian had captured, combined with the financial files from Richard Miller's drive, combined with the audio recording, was the physical anchor that tied the entire evidentiary structure to a specific place and a specific machine. He photographed everything, methodical. Each page, the prototype from multiple angles, the power conditioning unit's serial number, the antenna array from close enough to capture the manufacturing marks. Sandra was at one of the workstations. Her hands were on the keyboard. Her eyes were moving across the screen with the focused velocity of someone reading documentation she had been trying to find for a long time. The demonstration is scheduled for 11 days from now, she said quietly. Not 6 weeks. The date moved. A pause. Buyers are listed as 3 separate shell entities, all incorporated in Nevada, none of them with discoverable beneficial ownership. The transaction value, she stopped. Read it again. The transaction value is $230 million. Brian's voice came through James's phone, earpiece in, the connection they'd established. Before entering the building, I'm still capturing the transmission feed. Clean chain. But James, there's a second active transmission I'm picking up, not from the Tesla. Different device, different frequency. It's coming from inside the building. James went very still, because Williams had put surveillance in Sandra's car. Which meant Williams thought about surveillance the way certain people thought about insurance. The more coverage, the better, and you never knew which policy you'd need to use. And if there was an active transmitter in the building, then Williams knew they were here. Not possibly knew the transmitter would be monitoring motion, sound, electronic signals. 3 people in a building that was supposed to be empty at 11:30 on a Tuesday. Williams was somewhere receiving that information right now. James said 2 words. We're burned. Sandra straightened from the workstation. Nicole turned from the prototype. Nobody panicked, which was either a sign of exceptional composure or a sign that they had all, independently, arrived at the place where fear had burned through its own fuel and what remained was just clarity. Do you have enough? Nicole asked. Documentation, yes. The physical record is photographed. The drive, the financial files, the audio, the intercept chain, and now the prototype documentation. James looked around the room. It's enough. It's more than enough. Then we leave, Sandra said now. They were halfway to the fire door when the sublevel entrance opened. Williams came through it alone, which was either confidence or miscalculation, and James hadn't yet determined which. He was still in the charcoal suit from whatever event had occupied his Tuesday evening before this one. The jacket was slightly less perfect than it had been in the shop, not disheveled exactly, but carrying the particular quality of a man who had been moving quickly and was choosing to present as unhurried. He stopped when he saw all three of them, took in Sandra, then Nicole, then James. Something moved across his face, not surprise exactly, more like the recalculation of a chess player who has discovered that the board contained pieces he hadn't accounted for. Sandra. His voice was the same, still warm, remarkable that warmth, like a physical gift he'd had since birth and deployed without thinking. I didn't expect you to be this resourceful. Sandra looked at him with the gray eyes that did not show what was happening behind them. You've been in my company for 12 years, Robert. You should have expected exactly this. Your company. He said it the way you repeat a phrase that you find technically accurate but contextually incomplete. He took a few steps into the room, moving in the unhurried way of a man who believed he still controlled the geography of the situation. I've run this company for 12 years. The operational decisions, the vendor relationships, the financial architecture, the development pipeline. He looked at the prototype behind them with an expression that James could only describe as proprietary, the way a person looks at something they made. Dawnbreaker is the most significant technological achievement in Harlow Aerospace history. It will fund the next 20 years of legitimate development. He looked back at Sandra, and history will record who built it. Nicole said, history will record who shot my father. Williams looked at her. The warmth shifted. Didn't disappear, it was too practiced for that. But something underneath it rearranged itself into something less comfortable. Your father was a man of principles who failed to understand that principles have a price, and that someone always pays it. A pause. I didn't want that outcome. I want you to know that. I don't care what you wanted, Nicole said. Flat. Precise. The specific tone of someone who has had 3 years to figure out exactly what they would say in this moment, and is now saying it without ornamentation. I care what you did. Williams looked at her for a moment. Then, with the practiced pivot of a man accustomed to redirecting conversations that weren't going his way, you have documentation, presumably. And you believe you have a path to the appropriate federal authorities. He glanced at James's phone, the earpiece visible, the active call indicator on the screen. And your friend in the car outside has been building an evidentiary chain. He almost smiled. I'm not going to insult you by pretending I don't know what you've assembled. James watched him, waiting, because a man like Williams didn't walk into a room to concede, he walked in to negotiate. And the only reason you negotiate is if you believe you still have something to trade. What I will tell you, Williams continued, is that the people who have committed to this demonstration are not the kind of people who accept cancelled transactions gracefully. If Dawnbreaker is seized by federal agencies before the demonstration, if I am arrested, certain parties who are currently satisfied with the timeline will become unsatisfied. He looked at Sandra, and certain members of your family are visible, Sandra. Findable, particularly a young woman who drives a silver Audi A4 and visits a specific medical care facility in Lake Oswego every second Sunday. The room temperature didn't change, but something in it did. He knew about Nicole visiting Richard. He knew the schedule. He knew the car. Nicole's jaw set in the way it set when she had decided something. James recognized it. He'd seen it when she unfolded that email in the shop, and again when she opened the locket at Kelsey's diner, and again when she dropped into the utility corridor without hesitating. It was not the set of someone who was frightened. It was the set of someone who was done. You just threatened me, Nicole said. Not a question, not outrage. A simple factual observation delivered with the specificity of someone ensuring that the record was accurate. I'm describing a situation, Williams said. On a call that has been recording for the last 4 minutes, James said. Through a receiver that is simultaneously logging to a secure off-site server with federal-grade encryption. Williams looked at him. For the first time, the warmth was completely absent, not replaced by anger, by the particular blankness of a man who has just understood the geometry of his position. James held his phone up slightly. Let the pause do its work, Brian. Brian's voice through the earpiece, clearly enough for the room to hear. Got it. All of it, threat included. Timestamp confirmed. Williams stood very still, because he understood systems. He had designed financial systems and understood how they worked. And a man who understands systems understands, when he hears the description of a properly constructed one, that there is no individual pressure point that collapses the whole structure. The threat against Nicole was already recorded. Sending someone to act on it would only add to the record. Destroying the drive or the documentation in this room wouldn't eliminate what Brian had captured outside. Eliminating Brian wouldn't eliminate what was already logged to the off-site server. He had walked into a room where the net was already closed, and the person who had built it was a mechanic from SE Division Street who understood, from 12 years of engineering and 3 years of stripping things back to what was essential, that the most durable systems are the ones where no single failure point brings down the whole. Williams looked at James Smith, and for just a moment, brief, involuntary, the kind of thing that surfaces when a person has run out of calculated responses, his expression was something close to recognition. Mechanic to engineer, the specific acknowledgement of one person who understands systems for the person who built a better one. Then Sandra reached into a jacket and pulled out the tranquilizer pistol. It was a medical-grade device, the kind used in clinical settings for emergency sedation. She had carried it in her jacket since the safe house conversation. Williams looked at it, then at her, then at the $230 million machine behind her. "This is not how I wanted this to end," Sandra said. "I know," Williams said, and sounded for the first time like a person rather than a position. She fired. The dart caught him at the base of the neck. He went down in the way that large, professionally controlled people go down when the mechanism of their control is removed, not dramatically, just. Suddenly, the body completing the collapse that the will could no longer prevent. James caught him before he hit the floor. Because that was the kind of thing James Smith did, even now, even for this. He lowered Williams to the concrete with the same care he'd use, lowering anything that didn't need to be damaged more than it already was. Then he straightened, looked at Sandra. She was already on the phone, her head of security, the message short and precise. Location and situation, come now. Nicole stood beside the prototype and looked at her father's evidence and the machine it had almost cost him everything to expose. Her face was doing what it did when significant things were happening on the inside, which meant something significant was happening on the inside. James didn't look away from her, and after a moment she looked back at him, and neither of them said anything because what was required in that moment wasn't words. It was just the acknowledgement that it had happened, that they had gotten here, that the thing worth doing had been done. The federal agents arrived at the Sandy Boulevard facility at 12:43 in the morning. Not because heroes appear in the nick of time, because James had sent the complete evidentiary package to Jeffrey Lewis at the Office of Defense Technology Export Compliance. The former Westfield colleague, the federal connection he'd maintained through 7 years and 2 career reinventions at 8:17 that evening, 3 hours before they'd entered the building. Complete package, drive contents, financial documentation, Brian's intercept chain, the audio recording of Williams planning the demonstration timeline, and the address of the Sandy Boulevard facility, with a note that said, "We're going in tonight to document the physical prototype. If you don't hear from me by midnight, here's why you're not hearing from me." Jeffrey Lewis had heard from him at 12:04. A text with a single word confirmed. The FBI team was there in 39 minutes. Williams was conscious by then, sitting against the wall of Building C with his hands zip-tied in front of him, and his perfect hair marginally less perfect, looking at the prototype he had built with $40 million of other people's money, and 4 years of his own considerable intelligence, and whatever he was thinking, he kept it to himself. The warmth was gone. What remained was just a man in a good suit in a room where the things he had built were being photographed by federal agents with evidence markers. Paul, Sandra's head of security, arrived 2 minutes before the federal team. He was 50 broad, had the squared-off quality of a man who had spent years in close protection work and never quite left it even in corporate settings. He took in the room with one sweep and positioned himself, without being asked, between Williams and the exit. Because some professional habits operate below the level of conscious decision. Brian came in with the federal team, which nobody had planned but which made complete sense, because he was the one who had built the intercept chain, and the agents needed the technical architecture explained by the person who designed it. He walked in looking like a man who had skipped sleep and run on coffee and adrenaline, and was now experiencing the particular combination of exhaustion and satisfaction that comes from a system performing exactly as designed. He looked at James. "Clean chain," Brian said. "Federal standards. Every timestamp, every transmission. The receiving server Williams was using is already subject to a preservation order." James nodded. He was sitting on a workbench at the edge of the room, not in the way of the agents working the SIS, watching the federal machinery do what federal machinery does when the evidence is this complete. Sandra was in conversation with the lead agent, a woman named Catherine Hill, who wore the specific no-nonsense manner of someone who had seen corporate conspiracy cases dissolve on evidentiary problems enough times that she had learned to assess documentation quality before she assessed anything else. She was reviewing the drive contents on Brian's laptop and asking precise technical questions that Sandra answered with equal precision, and the exchange had the quality of two competent professionals establishing mutual ground. Nicole was standing near the north wall of Building C, not near the prototype, not near the federal activity, just standing, looking at nothing in particular, or at something that wasn't in the room. James crossed the space to where she was standing. He didn't say anything, neither did she for a moment. Outside, through the high industrial window, the first suggestion of pre-dawn was beginning at the edge of the eastern sky, not light exactly, just the night, becoming slightly less committed to darkness. Nicole's voice, when it came, was quiet enough that only he could hear it. He knew I'd find it. He planned it around what I would figure out. A pause. He was shot, and he was lying in a parking structure, and his first concern was making sure I would have a path to follow. She breathed. What kind of person plans something like that? James thought about the answer for a moment. Someone who didn't have enough faith in systems, he said, but had complete faith in you. Nicole was quiet. Then he said, find someone who fixes things. She looked at James directly. I think he meant someone who believes things can be fixed. Not everyone does. James looked at her. Do you? She considered it seriously, the way she considered everything. I think I'm starting to, she said. Again, the federal agents worked for 2 hours, cataloging, photographing, securing the prototype under a federal preservation order that meant no demonstration in 11 days or any other day, without a court releasing it, which was not going to happen. Williams was escorted out at 2:15. He walked without resistance. The kind of dignity that persists even when everything else is gone, because some people carry it in their bones regardless of circumstance, and it's possible to respect that even when you have no sympathy for the choices that led to the moment. James watched him go. Thought about the engineering at Westfield that hadn't survived the acquisition. Thought about the NV340 project that Williams had mentioned with proprietary familiarity. Thought about the specific cruelty of a system that takes something someone built and dismantles it for efficiency and leaves behind people who still understand what they made. He didn't forgive Williams. But he understood the shape of the thing that had turned him, which was not the same as forgiveness, but was perhaps a clearer way of seeing. The Harlow Aerospace board meeting happened 3 days later. Not the Thursday meeting Williams had scheduled, a different one, called by Sandra, with a quorum of 7 members, in the main conference room on the 12th floor of the Harlow Aerospace building in downtown Portland. James was not there. He had no reason to be there and no interest in being there. He was at the shop on SE Division Street, doing the work that had been waiting while everything else was happening, the Camry finally off the lift with its CV joint addressed, a Subaru Outback with a transmission issue that required careful diagnosis misses, Caldwell's ancient Volvo wagon that came in every 3 weeks for tire pressure and human contact. He took his time with Mrs. Caldwell's Volvo, checked the tire pressure, checked the belts while he was at it, made coffee and sat with her for 20 minutes, while she told him about her son in Seattle and the garden she was planning for spring. This was also work, the kind that didn't have a billing code. Sandra called at 2 in the afternoon. She said the board had voted to reinstate her as CEO, pending the completion of the federal investigation. She said the vote had been 6-1. She said the one dissenting vote was a board member who had been, as best the subsequent investigation would determine, aware of Williams's parallel operation, not a participant, but not unaware. That board member had submitted his resignation before the meeting ended. James said he was glad. He meant it. No more and no less than that. The contract, Sandra said. The fleet services agreement. I understand if you'd prefer to, I'll honor the contract, James said. It's good work. The vehicles are well engineered. A pause. And I'd prefer to know what I'm looking at when I'm looking at it. A silence that had something in it, not awkward. Warmer than that. The silence of 2 people who had been through something together and were now on the other side of it and finding the other side to be somewhat different territory than either of them had navigated before. "There's something I should have said at the beginning," Sandra said. "Before the service request, before the car, before any of this." A pause. "The Westfield acquisition, the restructuring. I reviewed the personnel files when it was over. I saw your name, your work on the NV340 project." Another pause. "I should have found a position for you. In the transition. I didn't. I allowed the restructuring team to move faster than was responsible, and people with genuine expertise were lost in the process." A beat. "I'm not offering you the contract as restitution. I want to be clear about that. I'm offering it because you're the best qualified vendor we've evaluated and you've demonstrated, under conditions that went significantly beyond automotive maintenance, that your judgment is sound." A pause. "But I am sorry. About Westfield. About the timing of what that cost you." James was quiet for a moment. 3 years of debt and adaptation, and the particular loneliness of rebuilding in a smaller space than you'd occupied before. 3 years of Kevin making do on a fraction of what had been planned and never complaining about it. 3 years of a wedding band tan line fading from his left hand. "It worked out," he said finally, which was true. Not in the way he'd planned. "But truth doesn't require the form you expected." Sandra said, "Yes, it did." The federal investigation into Project Dawnbreaker moved through the system with the deliberate pace of federal investigations. Which is to say, it moved slowly and thoroughly, and with the specific momentum of something that is not going to stop. Williams was charged under the Arms Export Control Act and the federal statute covering unauthorized development of weapons technology. Additional charges related to the surveillance installation in Sandra Anderson's vehicle and the threat against Nicole Torres were filed separately. His attorneys were excellent. The evidence was better. The shell entities in Nevada, the ones registered as buyers for the demonstration, were identified through the financial documentation from Richard Miller's drive and the transaction records captured in Brian's intercept chain. 3 of the individuals behind them received separate subpoenas. None of them were the kind of people who, when faced with federal subpoenas and the prospect of a conspiracy charge that would connect them to an attempted murder from 3 years prior, chose loyalty over self-interest. They cooperated, which is frequently how these things end. The prototype in Building C was secured by the federal government under a classified preservation order. What happened to it? After that was above the level of what James Smith of SE Division Street was authorized to know, and he found he didn't particularly need to. Richard Miller's medical team was expanded. Not at Harlow Aerospace expense, at Sandra Anderson's personal expense, which was a different thing and mattered because of the difference. New specialists, new treatment approaches that had shown promise in similar TBI cases at research institutions in Boston and Houston. The prognosis remained uncertain. It would remain uncertain for a long time. But Richard Miller was 51 years old and had been given 3 years of the best care available at the time, and now he was going to get better care, and in medicine, as in most things, better care changes the probability distribution of outcomes in ways that matter even when certainty isn't available. Nicole visited him the following Sunday, the regular second Sunday visit that Williams had known about and used as a threat, and which Nicole refused to alter by a single hour because refusing to alter it was its own kind of statement. She sat across from her father in the same visiting room where she had sat for 3 years. He looked at her the way he had been looking at her for 3 years, with the careful courtesy of a man who knows he should know the person in front of him and cannot locate where he put that knowledge. And then he looked at the chain around her neck, the silver chain where the locket used to be, the locket she had opened and emptied and now wore as what it had always also been, something her father gave her because he loved her. He looked at the chain, then at her face, then back at the chain. "Nicole," he said, one word, uncertain, like a word in a language he had almost forgotten that had come back to him in a dream, and he wasn't sure if he was awake or asleep and was saying it out loud to find out. Nicole held very still, because some moments require absolute stillness, because the wrong movement can disturb something fragile, because sometimes the most important thing you can do is simply be there, still and present, and wait for the person you love to find their way back to you. "Nicole," Richard Miller said again, more certain this time. "The way you say a word once you've remembered it." She didn't say anything. She just took his hand, and he looked at her with the beginning of something, not a full return, Not in one moment. The damage was real and recovery is not cinematic, but the beginning. The first thread of reconnection in 3 years of silence, she cried then. Not the controlled moisture around the eyes that she had permitted herself at Kelsey's diner, or in the utility corridor, or in Building C. Actually cried. The kind that comes from somewhere below where composure lives, from the part of a person that has been waiting for permission. She was 21 years old, and her father had come back to her by degrees, through a room that smelled like antiseptic and the particular loneliness of institutional care. And it was not everything. It was not the Sunday afternoons with the Mustang and the jokes she'd heard 3 times. And the hiking trails, where he'd explained the world to her with the patience of a man who genuinely believed understanding things was worth the effort. It was enough. Right now in this room, it was enough. Kevin got the scholarship. Not second alternate. First. The 2 people ahead of him had declined, one for a full ride to Oregon State, one for a family reason that the foundation didn't disclose. The letter arrived on a Thursday, and Kevin called James from the PCC campus between classes, and James had to sit down in the middle of the shop because his knees did something unexpected. They went to dinner that Friday. A place on Alberta Street that they'd been saying they'd try for 2 years and kept not trying because the prices were slightly above their usual threshold. They sat at a table by the window and ordered things from the menu without calculating the total first, which was its own small liberation. Kevin wanted to talk about the electromagnetic field course, about the problem sets that had been killing him for 3 weeks and had finally clicked into coherence earlier that week. James listened. Really listened. Not the listening you do when you're also tracking something else: the day's revenue, the overdue invoice, the medical debt calculation he had run so many times it lived in his fingers. Just his son's voice and the way Kevin's eyes moved when he was explaining something he found genuinely interesting. At some point Kevin said, "You've been somewhere else lately. Like, in a different headspace." Good different, not worried different. James looked at his son, 20 years old, studying electromagnetic systems at Portland Community College, working nights, carrying his own weight without complaint, sounding like his mother when he was patient and like his father when he wouldn't let a problem alone. Things shifted a little, James said. Work stuff. Kevin gave him the look that said he knew there was more and had decided to let his father keep his version for now. The aerospace contract, that's part of it. Is the rest of it? Kevin stopped, reorganized. Are you okay? The question was simple, asked with the directness of someone who had watched his father carry things alone for 3 years and wanted to offer, without fanfare, an alternative arrangement. James looked at his son for a moment. "Yeah," he said. "I'm okay." A pause. "I think I'm actually okay." Kevin nodded. Went back to the electromagnetic field problem. Because that was Kevin, he checked in, got the answer he needed, and trusted it, the way you trust something that has been proven reliable over time. They split dessert. Because why not? Sandra signed the contract renewal 3 weeks after the federal investigation opened. Not the original contract. The new one revised terms. Extended scope. A provision that James had insisted on regarding maintenance transparency, and a clause that Sandra had insisted on regarding service priority for the executive fleet. They had negotiated 2 provisions that neither of them entirely won, which is how good contracts work. She signed it in the shop, standing at the workbench, using the pen James kept in the mug by the register, which was a decent pen but not a remarkable one. The contrast between the pen and the value of what she was signing was not lost on either of them. James signed his copy. They exchanged documents, shook hands. Her grip was the same as the first time, firm, cool, brief. Except this time when she released it, neither of them immediately moved to the next thing. "Your former supervisor at Westfield," Sandra said, "Gary Martin. He's currently consulting for an aerospace startup in Beaverton. The work is below his skill level. I have a senior systems position opening in our legitimate R&D division next quarter." She paused. "I'm not asking you to vet him. I'm telling you because you worked with him. And because doing the right thing occasionally includes doing it in both directions." James looked at her. "That's thoughtful." "Don't make it remarkable," Sandra said. "It's just competent." Which was, he was coming to understand, her version of a high compliment. She left, and the shop was quiet in the particular way it got at the end of a day when everything that needed to happen had happened. James stood at the workbench and looked at his signed copy of the contract and thought about the morning 6 weeks ago, when an unknown number had called at 6:47 and a voice had said, "I'm sending a car in 20 minutes," and he had stood in this exact shop with grease on his hands and a calendar on the wall, and his son asleep upstairs and no idea what any of it meant yet. He thought about Laura, about safe and right, about the way some decisions reveal themselves to be decisions only in retrospect, and how the most important ones often look, at the moment you're making them, like something much smaller. A flat tire. 11 minutes, $20 declined. The shop bell above the door chimed. Nicole came in. She did that sometimes now. Not for car lessons, though they'd done 3 of those, actual lessons the way Richard Miller had described his Sunday afternoons. She came by the way people come by places where something important happened to them, and they find themselves drawn back, not because they need anything specific, but because the specific gravity of significant places is real even when you can't measure it. She sat on the stool by the tool rack, looked at the contract on the workbench. Renewed, signed today. Good. She looked around the shop, the tools, the lift, the fluorescent light that still flickered over the tool rack, and that James had decided he was not going to fix, because it had been flickering since the morning all of this started, and he'd developed something like affection for it. "My father said my name again on Sunday," Nicole said. James set down the pen, looked at her. Not just the one word. He said. She stopped, breathed, the careful breath of someone handling something precious. He said, "Nicole, your hair is different, because I cut it last month. Short," and he noticed she paused. "He's in there, coming back." Slowly. Her voice was steady in the way it was always steady. But underneath the steadiness was something that wasn't controlled, something that had been given permission to simply be. The doctors say it could be months, could be longer, could be they don't know exactly. She looked at James directly. "But he's in there." James nodded. There wasn't a better response than that. Just acknowledgement. Just, "I hear this important thing you're telling me." Nicole looked at the contract on the workbench. He said, "Find someone who fixes things." A pause. "I think he also meant for you, not just for me." She met James's eyes. "You were broken too. Just less obviously." James Smith looked at that for a moment. At the truth of it. At the way it landed, not like an accusation but like something offered with the open hand of someone who understood it from the inside. "Yeah," he said. "Probably." The fluorescent light flickered once. Held. The shop smelled like oil and metal, and the particular ordinariness of a place where work got done. Outside, SE Division Street went about its business. Portland in October. Rain coming. The river somewhere in the distance. James Smith was 42 years old. He had a son who had gotten the scholarship and was learning about electromagnetic fields and ate sandwiches on a stool in the shop sometimes, and had his mother's patience. He had a shop that was going to be okay. He had a contract from a woman who was learning, late and with difficulty. That control is not the same as safety, and that the people who have already lost things are sometimes the steadiest ones in the room. He had a drive on a chain around the neck of a young woman who was watching her father return to her word by word. He did not have everything he had lost. He was not going to get everything back. The wedding band tan line was gone. The house in Beaverton was someone else's house. Westfield Dynamics was a company that existed in his memory, and in the patents that bore his name, in filings nobody consulted anymore. But he had built something from what remained. Something that worked. Not spectacularly, not in the way that gets written up in Forbes or photographed for industry awards. Just solidly, reliably. The kind of built that holds, which in the end is the only kind that matters. He picked up the pen, put it back in the mug, looked at Nicole. "You want coffee?" he asked. She considered it with the seriousness she brought to most things. "Yeah," she said. "Yeah, I do." He went to make it. The fluorescent light held steady. The shop door was unlocked. Outside, the first drops of rain began to come down on SE Division Street, the way they always did in October, the way they would again next. October and the one after that, indifferent to everything that had changed and everything that hadn't, doing what Portland rain does in the fall, falling and not stopping.